I believe I should get started. We're at 11:01. And to those of you just joining us, just want to make sure you're all in the right spot. Today we are hosting session 1 for our learning forum, Healing School Communities in the Context of Faith-Based Bullying, and What Do We Know? I am Danielle Ragib. I am really excited to facilitate today's session. I am deeply, deeply honored to be here and share space with you all today. I come to you as moderator today as someone with direct experience in school mental health, as well as a behavioral health provider. I am an LCSW here in the state of California. My clinical career has primarily focused on crisis work and working with individuals from multi-ethnic backgrounds. I myself come from a very diverse background and a multi-denominational family. I had the privilege of growing up with a Catholic mother and a Muslim father. Additionally, I am here today as someone with lived experience who has also witnessed and experienced anti-Muslim hate in the world. Again, thank you all for joining us this morning. Appreciate you being here. And I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I think we're going to go ahead and bring up our slide deck that we have for today. All right. And just a couple of reminders that I'm going to get us through. Just a second. Sorry, there's a little bit of a lag. So a couple housekeeping things regarding today's logistics for our meeting, just so we can get that out of the way. To ensure that you all have the best quality for the duration of this meeting, we have muted mics for all participants except today's speakers. If you have any sort of audio or technical issues during the session, the Q&A is open for you to communicate with our team so that they may assist you. We welcome you to use the chat box respectfully, and many of you have already started with discernment so that we can focus the conversation on today's speakers. If you have a link or a resource you'd like to share with other attendees or questions for the presenters, please enter those into the question and answer pod. We have team members monitoring the Q&A pod, and they will ensure that the facilitators receive your questions. To open the Q&A pod, all you have to do is hover your cursor over the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your window, and you just click on the Q&A function, and voila. We do have scheduled time for Q&A with our guests toward the end of the meeting, but again, please feel free to enter your question at any time into the Q&A box. We have made every attempt to make today's presentation secure. If we need to end the presentation unexpectedly, we will do so, and we will follow up with you directly using the information that was entered during the time that you registered. And then there will be some instructions on how to access anything further. You will receive an email following the presentation on how to access the session recording and your certificate of attendance. The session recording will be available on our website within a few days, and as part of receiving SAMHSA funding, we are required to submit data related to the quality of this event after today's event. And so at the end of today's training, we ask that you please take a moment to complete a brief survey about today's session. All attendees will automatically be redirected to the survey when closing the webinar window when this event ends, so try not to fret about it. And if you don't already, please follow us on social media and stay in touch with us. And I think I probably forgot to say this, but we are from the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center Network. We are a TA center that supports 10 regional centers across the country. I'm going to go ahead and move us on. And so if you are new to us, this is a two-part series. It is a collaborative effort of the Mental Health Technology Transfer Centers. Again, the network is funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. The MHTTC network includes 10 regional centers and a network coordinating office. Our collaborative network supports resource development, dissemination, training, and technical assistance and workforce development for the mental health field, and have a very specific initiative that focuses on school mental health. Please visit our website to learn more. We'll add the link in the chat box for everyone. And after today's session, we suggest you visit our website and find your regional center to keep in touch with us for more resources and training opportunities. And you can visit our website, and we'll also put that in the chat. This presentation was prepared for the MHTTC network under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA. The opinions expressed in this learning session are the views of our moderator and panelists and do not reflect the views of the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services, or SAMHSA. All right. Now that we have our kind of logistics and disclaimers out of the way, let's move on. So you might be asking, why this, why now? And just want to offer a couple words to really frame the session. So healing school communities in the context of faith-based bullying is a two-part learning series that's intended for students, families, educators, and school mental health professionals who are navigating the impact of faith-based bullying on student mental health, with a specific focus on anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim hate and pro-belonging on students and staff. You'll notice that we are using that language specifically because we believe it humanizes the conversation and keeps us centered on the people who hurt and the people who heal. It is part of our Healing School Communities learning series that we began in 2020 in the context of racial violence. One of our team members is going to drop the learning summary of that series, some recordings and resources in the chat for you all. We welcome you to check out our main event page to read more about the context of this program, the intended outcomes and intentions, and what this will not be. Our event page also houses an enormous amount of resources to enrich your learning after our series closes, including CVs of all the works connected to our speakers today. Today's session focuses on what do we know, research and data exploring the intersections of bullying, belonging, anti-Muslim hate, anti-Jewish hate, school climate, and more. Thursday's session, part 2, focuses on the practice and how might we grow. This is not an all-encompassing how-to, and to that end, we have 2 notes. School mental health is complicated work. Navigating the impact of faith-based bullying is complicated work. For some of us, this is an entirely new conversation, and others, very similar and part of your everyday. For some of us, this is more abstract, and for others, this is deeply proximate and real. We are centering this conversation on anti-Muslim and anti-Jewish bullying. This does not mean we are not interested or invested in students or school mental health advocates who do not identify as Muslim or Jewish. We know that anti-Muslim bullying often impacts students who are Sikh or who are profiled as Muslim but aren't, as an example. We believe the data and practice related to anti-Muslim and anti-Jewish school experiences benefits the collective. To that end, we offer a couple working agreements for us as we listen in to all of us. We will be in listen and reflect mode today. To both speakers and all of us as listeners, we invite you to receive today's conversation thinking about what you agree with and why, what might you argue with and why, and what shifts in yourself might come from this conversation. Expect and accept a lack of closure. We won't get to everything today, and that's okay. This work is ongoing. You'll see on screen our network's values. These hold us accountable in how we design and experience learning spaces together. We welcome you to embrace these with us. To our presenters and guests, we agree and commit to making space, stepping in and stepping back when there is a question posed to all of us. And we commit to keeping our thoughts brief, spoken from our role and our experience, and respecting the frame and nonpartisan audience of our MHTTC network. And raise your hand when you want to speak. With that, we're going to go ahead and take the slides down in a sec. You can see all of our guests today on screen, but we're actually going to invite them to come on camera so you can see them in live action. And we're going to take down the slides and go from there. I'm going to begin to introduce our guest. And so our first, starting with Dr. Dennis Barr, Dr. Nadia Ansari, Dr. Rania Awad, Dr. Saida Abdi, sorry, Dr. Samantha Vinakor Meinrat, and Dr. Shireen Nasser. Note that Sari Costin was on the original panel but cannot make it, and we are grateful to Samantha for stepping in last minute. For Samantha and all the speaker bios, please visit our website, the Healing School Communities in the Context of Faith-Based Bullying panelists, and I believe we are going to go ahead and put that in the chat for you as well. I just want to give all of our panelists a moment to get on screen, on camera, and welcome you all. And thank you again for being here. Again, very honored to share space with you all this morning. As we start, I do want to take a moment to recognize that we are amidst many overwhelming moments. The still present impact of COVID-19, war and violence and grief, in addition to the alarming rise in physical and verbal violence towards and sometimes from Muslims and Jews. Students and young people are watching, learning, and leading us through both. So as we kick off, I'm hoping you can introduce yourselves, briefly, name, role, location, pronouns, and why did you say yes to this conversation? What about this conversation is important to you? And those you support, teach, serve right now. And please, if possible, keep your shares brief. And let's go ahead and start with Shireen.
Hello, I'm so pleased to be here with all of you. My name is Dr. Shireen Nasser. I'm an associate professor of psychology at Cleveland State University. I'm a school psychologist by training. I live in Cleveland, Ohio. My pronouns are she, her. I said yes to this conversation because it's a topic I feel like we don't talk about nearly enough in our quest to better understand youth mental health and people's lived experiences. As a university professor, someone who works in schools, as a Palestinian American, as a mom, I hope that our understanding of faith-based bullying can expand our understanding of how bullying and discrimination broadly impacts all of our kids, so we can ultimately better support them.
Thank you, Shireen. And I'm going to hand the mic to Samantha.
Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here today. My name is Samantha Vinakor Meinrat. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm based in New York, where I work at an organization called the Jewish Education Project, overseeing national work on anti-Semitism education, among other hats. And I am the author of a book called #Anti-Semitism, Coming of Age During the Resurgence of Hate. I said yes to this conversation, both as a reluctant expert in the field of anti-Semitism as it relates to young people. It's not something any of us want to be good at, to say the least, but something that feels absolutely critical at this moment to be in conversation about, and to be in conversation with this group of colleagues, and to learn from those who are working specifically with other faith-based communities that I honestly don't have as much exposure to, and want to continue being a learner alongside everyone here.
Thank you, Samantha. And thank you again for coming on last minute. I'm going to now hand the mic to Saida.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Saida Abdi. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Minnesota School of Social Work. I am also the director for the Circle Project, which is a SAMHSA-funded Cat3 project, which is school-based mental health. And we serve Afghan children, East African children, so we serve a lot of Muslim kids as well as Latinx kids. I said yes to this conversation because this is actually where I live daily. As someone who is doing school-based mental health, I work with kids that are highly impacted by anti-Muslim bullying and bias. And I'm constantly having a conversation about this with parents, with schools, with communities, with specifically, more importantly, with children. So I really live in this space. So I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to talk to others who are experts. And the question we are tackling today, the questions we are tackling today are part of my daily conversations, as I said before, and I want to learn from others and really share what we do and what we know, and also hear what others do and hopefully gain, as well as share what I already know. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And passing the mic on to Rania.
Hello, everybody. My name is Rania Awad, and I'm a professor at Stanford University School of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry. I've authored a book called Islamophobia and Psychiatry, and also direct a research lab called the Muslim Mental Health and Islamic Psychology Lab, where we do quite a bit of research actually on the topic of Islamophobia as well. And one more thing, I'm co-founder and president of a nonprofit in the community called Maristan, and that's a Muslim mental health initiative. We have a program called MMHI, Muslim Mental Health Initiative, that happens on college campuses. So I said yes to this program because this entire year, I spent a good deal of time on college campuses, not as a professor, but actually having these programs for Muslim students, and just seeing the support that's needed this entire year. So I'm glad to have this conversation and be in conversation with all of you.
Thank you. And I'm going to pass the mic to Nadia.
Thank you. Good morning or good afternoon. I'm Nadia Ansari. I'm a professor and the department chairperson for the Department of Psychology at Rider University in New Jersey. My pronouns are she, her. In terms of what motivated me to participate in this talk today is that this topic is really at the nexus of several areas of research interest of mine. The first is bullying. The second is, and not these aren't in any order, of course, but Muslim mental health, and then the effects of bias on identity development and mental health. So faith-based bullying is really at the intersection of these areas of interest, and I'm thankful to be a part of the panel today.
Thank you. Thank you. Grateful to have you here. And lastly, pass it on to Dennis.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dennis Barr. I'm the Senior Director of Evaluation for Facing History and Ourselves, which is an educational organization that uses the lessons of history to challenge teachers and their students to stand up to bigotry and hate. My pronouns are he, him, and I am living in the Boston area. I was really attracted from the moment I was invited to be a part of this because I could tell the thoughtfulness of the way in which this whole topic was being approached by your team, and the importance, obviously, of the topic to me and to, I think, our society right now. I'm a developmental psychologist and a researcher, and I've had a lifelong interest in the many different factors that support all youth to thrive and to become contributors to a more just and compassionate society.
Thank you so much, Dennis. And thank you to all of you for your brief introductions. And again, just really excited to hear more from all of you and just be here today. So I'm going to get us started. So let's start with creating some shared knowledge about the scope of the conversation we're having today. What are students and staff experiencing when it comes to anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim bullying? What are the common characteristics and circumstances of faith-based bullying incidents? How might bullying differ from harassment or discrimination, and why is that important? Nadia and Samantha, knowing your bodies of work are anchored here, let's go ahead and start with you two. And I'll hand the mic off to Nadia.
Okay, thank you. So I want to focus, there's two parts to the question. The first about experiences of Muslim students and adults at school. And then the other question is about how harassment and bullying may be different. So in terms of experiences of Muslims in school related to bias-based experiences, some folks have experienced no discernible experiences of discrimination, while others report overt forms of hate. So anti-Muslim bias can take on many shapes, including but not limited to microaggressions, which are minor insults, othering, which can include ostracizing or excluding someone for just being Muslim, and more severe forms of bias, such as being called an ethnic or religious slur, harassment, and violence. Most often, anti-Muslim bias rests on stereotypes about Muslims as other, as un-American or violent, and often religious identity is conflated with race or ethnicity, such as characterizing all Muslims as Arabs and vice versa. Even though it's an obvious fact, it bears mentioning that, or worth mentioning, that Muslims who wear visible symbols of their religious identity, such as women wearing the hijab or headscarf, are at increased risk for being targeted. The last point I want to make concerns what happens when an allegation of bullying is made by Muslim students. Research suggests that when Muslim students report bullying to adults at school, most often nothing is done to remedy the situation. Failing to address bias-based bullying amplifies the harm that's been done by conveying the message that the child is not important or is, in essence, invisible to the school community. It also emboldens other youth to engage in bullying of Muslim youth, since they can see that there are no consequences for the behavior. So it's absolutely critical that schools adequately respond in these instances. Also, research suggests that in 25% of bullying cases reported by Muslim students, teachers were identified as the perpetrator. This research finding has been replicated numerous times in ISPU's annual report on Islamophobia. So it's clear that more work needs to be done, especially with respect to teacher training, especially in cases where teachers are working with increasingly diverse populations. And we also have to recognize the vulnerability of this population to bias-based incidents at school. So that is the anti-Muslim perspective. And so I will pass on to Samantha.
Thank you, Nadia, and thank you so much for sharing. So when I'm thinking about what Jewish students are experiencing and Jewish teachers, staff, other members of school community are experiencing when it comes to anti-Jewish bullying, I first just want to give a shared definition of anti-Semitism for the purposes of our time together, because I actually think it's very helpful. So this is from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance and was adopted in 2016 as a non-legally binding definition of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. The reason that there's several reasons that, like, to the extent that someone can say, I have a favorite definition of anti-Semitism that counts as mine. But what I want to really highlight here is this idea of a perception of Jews that only may come across as hatred. It's really easy for us to identify when hatred is how bullying manifests. We can say swastika drawn on Jewish students' locker or notebook. We all pretty much know what that is. We know that it is anti-Jewish bullying. We know it's anti-Jewish hatred. We know that it is anti-Semitism. And we hope that our school communities are trained to respond in meaningful ways. They unfortunately aren't always, but there are steps that can be taken. But the overall perception of Jews is often what I want to think about when it comes to anti-Jewish bullying. In so many spaces, Jews are not or have not been seen as a disenfranchised minority. There's a difference between being a minority by numbers, which we know that Jews are, as less than 2% of the population of the United States, but to then have a minoritized identity is something completely different and something that many Jewish students and staff have not had to deal with before, because although this is a stereotype and not accurate, because the majority of the Jewish community presents as white, there is a sense that because Jews are seen as white, we don't have the same experience as other minorities. And there's certainly a whole separate conversation to be had acknowledging white privilege for those of us who come from Ashkenazi, that is Eastern European backgrounds, and that is how we present in the world. But for so many Jews to then be told safe spaces for minorities aren't for you. You don't belong here. Your experience isn't valid because yours is one of power and privilege when we think about the social constructs of minority and majority today. We are minority by numbers. We are minority by our story and our shared experience. But when we look at minority as a question of power, people don't think of Jews that way. And therefore, almost similar to what I was really interested in what Nadia had said, there's a gaslighting that comes when a student or a staff member is brave enough to report anti-Jewish bullying or harassment that they experience and are then told, no, that's not possible. And some of that comes from the insidious nature of anti-Semitism, where Jews experiencing harassment or discrimination are almost socially conditioned to not seek access to power in order to counter it, because one of the key stereotypes of anti-Semitism is of Jews pulling the strings and having the money and having the power and controlling the world, and I'm only being slightly facetious, because that's the perception as it is, there is a step back that always has to be taken to say, am I going to report? Or if I go to the top right away, will it be playing into the stereotypes? I also just want to name and acknowledge that staff members are experiencing anti-Semitism as well, staff members and students. This is coming in the form of Nazi paraphernalia more and more frequently than anyone wants to see. Stories of the only Jewish teacher in a school or in a department having students, instead of raising their hands in a traditional way, raise them in a Nazi salute, but then saying, I mean, that's how I raised my hand. So you can't say that that was officially bullying or discrimination when it was. We see it in the lack of openness of minority safe spaces and for opportunities where otherwise a minority community would be encouraged to come together, to be honored, to be celebrated and appreciated within a school community, not being open to Jewish students, faculty, and staff, and numerous other examples that I'm eager to get into later, but I want to kick it back to our moderator, to Danielle, to keep the conversation going.
Thank you both so much, Nadia and Samantha, for sharing and for getting us started in the conversation. We're also seeing a rising need to name the intersection of mental health, belonging, and faith-based bullying, kind of some of the things you both spoke about a little bit. Help us understand this intersection, especially as it impacts how we support students and staff at this moment. What does that intersection look like and feel like? How does faith-based bullying compare to other forms of bullying in terms of frequency and impact? How does identity-based bullying uniquely impact our mental health? We're going to go ahead and start with Rania, then we'll go to Saida and Samantha. So I'm going to pass the mic to Rania.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. When you think about the effect of Islamophobia, I'll start there and say, and by the way, Islamophobia and anti-Semitism go hand in hand in what I'm going to say next. Whenever one spikes, the other spikes. It's absolutely, this is what the research has always showed us. Now, in terms of focusing more on, Muslim students and families and adults even, especially in this last while, certainly we see that whenever the rates that are for Islamophobia are higher, kind of just this kind of anti-Muslim bias or anti-Muslim faith-based bias is certainly higher than in other groups. The ISPU, the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding, has these annual polls that they put out. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of sense of what those numbers look like. Muslims remain the most likely to report experiencing religious discrimination, somewhere hovering around 62% of all Muslims here in America, compared to our Jewish friends who are 52%, for example. So there's a bit of both are high compared to any other faith group, but certainly the Muslim group continues to face higher, both generally and also in institutional settings. There you could see it almost triple any other faith group. If you look, for example, at children, I'm specifically interested in school-aged children, the numbers there for identity, faith-based identity discrimination is actually double the next faith group, which in this case would be the Jewish children, Jewish students, double, right? In terms of whether it be their name, something that they're eating at lunch, maybe something visible about them, maybe a girl who's wearing hijab or something to that nature. So double. And I say this also as a parent, knowing that as I send my children who are school aged out into the world, there's a 50% chance, it's a 50-50 chance that on any given day, they're going to be discriminated against because of their Muslim identity. Always causes me to pause as a parent. And then next I'll share as a mental health professional, as a psychiatrist in this case, I definitely take pause in terms of really bridging the connection. And for the longest time, there wasn't data on this, but our research has allowed for the data to show there is a direct connection between Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bias to mental health. So the increase in depression, the increase in anxiety, the increase in social anxiety, the worry about kind of being visible about your identity is very much there, not just with the young people, but also with adults and with their parents of young children who are worried about what does it mean when I send my child onto the world with a visible sounding Muslim name or some attire that may make them more of a target. So just things to start this reflection, and I'll pass it on to my next panelist.
Thank you, Rania. We're going to pass it on to Saida.
Thank you, both of you. And I think because you have said a lot about the research, I would actually say a lot about kids and the work we ask children to do. My program is school-based. We do research. We actually look at the social ecology. We don't look at just what children are experiencing psychologically, but also what's happening in their social ecology, what's happening at home, what's happening in the school environment, what's happening in the communities in which they live. And so if we think about the intersection of belongingness, mental health, and bullying and anti-Muslim bias or anti-Semitic bias, think about what children, a young girl, a 13-year-old who wears hijab, the work she has to do in the morning as she goes to school. Do I keep my hijab on? And this is like what we hear from the kids. Do I keep my hijab on and get bullied at school? Or do I take it off and betray everything that matters, my family, my community, my faith? Do I have my name that is Muslim sounding, or do I shorten it so that I can pass? Do I eat everything everyone eats? Do I go out and drink because my friends do? Or do I not? So when we are not doing the adult work, we're asking children to do the work. And for me to go back to what Nadia said, it is really what our school is doing, what are the adults, holding the adults in that environment accountable, because we know those children as they go into those schools, because we are not doing the work of building inclusive communities, because we are not actually looking at our communities in our schools and saying, well, I'm in Minnesota, a year, 2 years ago, before the Afghan kids came, hardly any Afghans there. Now you have schools with a big number of Afghan kids, different language, different culture, hijabs. What are we doing as schools? Because we know bullying is going to happen, as you said, the data shows us. We know those children, that it impacts children's sense of belongingness and connection. And we know that impacts children's psychological wellness. So we know all of this. And I really, for me, especially because I work with children who have already experienced huge traumas, who came here for protection and safety. And when their identity, the core of who they are, is attacked, and that's what faith-based bullying does, then we are telling them no place is safe for you. So for me, that is really what today's conversation is how can we as adults, we know we have the data that shows us that those children are suffering in our schools. We have the knowledge of what that looks like and how it happens, the mechanism. And we actually have a good understanding of what we can do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saida. And I'm going to pass the mic to Samantha.
Thank you. I was like aggressively nodding at everything that Saida said, and I'm so saddened by how much, on behalf of the Jewish young people who I have the pleasure of working with, how relatable all of it is. Because so much of what I'm thinking about when it's about the intersection of mental health and belonging and faith-based bullying is this tremendous burden of responsibility that has been placed onto young people and that they have placed onto themselves, that when we name it out loud, we would never want this for them. And we know that it's developmentally inappropriate. Every Jewish choice that a young person who identifies as Jewish is making today is being made against this backdrop of rising anti-Semitism. They're making all the same choices that my colleagues were discussing. Do I show up visibly Jewish? Do I put on the Star of David, the Magen David? Do I wear a kippah, a head covering, if that would have otherwise been my practice? Not only ritual objects, but also culturally associated objects. Can I wear a shirt that has Hebrew writing on it that truly just says like Coca-Cola in Hebrew because I thought it was whimsical, but now it's seen as other and frightening and worth being attacked for? Can I put markers of my Jewish identity on my home? A lot of college students saying, I don't want to have a mezuzah, a marker on my door showing that I'm Jewish. Maybe I'm changing my name on Uber or at Starbucks because it visibly identifies me and I don't know who's out there in the world and how they're going to be encountering my full self. And then we see there's this closeting of a core part of someone's identity. In research that was conducted on Jewish teens who participate in immersive experiences with their peers, so like specifically the most engaged, active teens, they're creating second and separate social media accounts on Instagram or TikTok or wherever else it is that they're spending their time, specifically to document their Jewish time, saying the rest of my life goes over here, whatever I'm doing in sports and school and food and every other part of what makes me myself. But I still want to document my Jewish stuff. I'm proud of it. I like it. It's a core part of who I am. But I don't want to open the rest of my life up to the anti-Semitic bullying that I know is going to be coming if I share all parts of myself in one space. In research on specifically Jewish teens for the last quarter of 2023 and beginning of 2024, I just want to give some numbers. 61% of Jewish teens said they experienced in-person discrimination on the basis of their Jewish identity. 46% said they experienced online discrimination. 74% said they've seen an increase in discrimination against them or their peers within their school or their extracurricular activities. 55% said they have been concerned about attending school as Jewish, as visibly or known to be Jewish. And 45% of Jewish teens say that there has been some incident of in-person anti-Semitism that they have either experienced or witnessed, but not reported. So we know how much of this is going unreported in all areas. But recognizing what impact this has on mental health when already we're in the middle of a loneliness epidemic for everyone. We are in the middle of such a crisis of meaning and understanding. And that becomes all the more so augmented when a young person then has that bifurcation of identity where, because of this burden that's been placed onto them to represent their people and not just themselves, to be representative of something bigger, sometimes that's amazing to know that you're part of something bigger. That's a beautiful thing. That's why we connect with all of the different communities that we're part of and our intersectional identities. And they're seeing it through this lens of personal responsibility, in the sense of, if I don't feel comfortable wearing, again, something that marks me as visibly Jewish, and so I take it off, is this a commentary that I'm not proud, that I'm not confident, that I have hatred and, don't like who I am? And then I get to say, no, I think it's a commentary on a world that has made you feel unsafe. And how do we think about that rather than turning it into a space where it's a commentary on who they are as individuals at a moment where their identities are still being shaped? And we want these to be both complex and positive shaping experiences.
Thank you, Samantha, and thank you. Thanks to everyone for your responses. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next question. Just trying to get us through. We have so many wonderful questions to get through, and then also the Q&A. So just let us move on and go on to the next. So how does climate, example, cultural, religious, social dynamics influence faith-based bullying, and who accesses it, belonging or not? And this is, I'm going to pass the mic to Shireen.
Great. So I'm glad I got this question as a school psychologist. This is definitely my jam. School belonging is made up of two pieces. It's personal relationships, but also systems. And I think we've talked a lot about kind of that individual experience and how you might have that personal interaction, like microaggressions that Nadia talked about and Samantha talked about, that a student experiences that discrimination. But something we don't often talk about that really impacts belonging, and I want to highlight here for faith-based bullying, is these system level factors like school climate, school policies, curricula, school safety. Schools are truly a microcosm of the greater culture in which they exist. We know that anti-Semitism, for example, fuels the politics of white nationalism. We know that anti-Muslim hate fuels the politics of, the Muslim as the antithesis to democracy. We have to understand that that shows up in our school curriculum and the way that our teachers might either purposely or inadvertently pass on that microcosm of the greater culture to students. I can speak specifically to Muslim students in my own research that there are three ways that this system level factor impacts students. One is primarily through classroom bias. One is through instructional materials. We actually reviewed over here in Northeast Ohio 10 different textbooks representing over 20 different counties. And they're all American history textbooks, kind of laying the narrative for who is American, what happens, what creates America, and the history of our country. Out of reviewing every single one of these textbooks with a fine-tooth comb, not a one of them talked about any Muslim story that was not related to a narrative of terrorism and oil. Not one of them. So these are the things that our students are being exposed to. So what does that mean in kind of the day-to-day for a student? Our students are then, we interviewed these students who are exposed to these textbooks. So we've done interviews with 15 students who were in the same counties where we looked at these textbooks. And they're essentially saying, I'm hearing the message, I'm getting it. I'm getting that I don't belong here. I'm getting that I'm not part of what is considered American. We also know that teacher instructional style can also influence students. There's a lot of overlap between the instructional material and teachers, because when teachers don't have specific training in something like understanding anti-Muslim hate and anti-Semitism, they fall back on these curricula that are the that bring in that greater cultural piece. For example, in our case, as Muslims as antithesis to democracy. And so teachers then end up spreading these biases. And I think Nadia quoted that quote of 25% of the bullying that Muslim students experience come from teachers. And also our students are reporting from what and how teachers are teaching. And then finally, this idea that Muslim students are often silenced because teachers or schools don't have the capacity or are unwilling to engage students in critical discourse about geopolitics. We can't separate our students' lives from the greater globe that we live in. And when teachers feel ill-equipped, often what happens is we're silencing students. There was a 2011 study that was done by Benet et al., where they talked about how when we can't allow for critical discourse about geopolitics, particularly to the Middle East, we see a decrease in discrimination, because students then, instead of relying on stereotypes and biases, can dig into history and story and critical theories and understanding to better understand each other, so they aren't relying on that discrimination. Our students in our own research are sharing that there are three main things that they're experiencing when they're exposed to these classroom biases. One is emotional. Our Muslim students are grieving. They're experiencing a lot of shame because of the way Islam is produced and talked about in these textbooks and school culture broadly. They're experiencing these cognitions of, I don't belong here. If I don't belong here, then I won't come here. If I won't come here, I don't need to be engaged with the curriculum. I don't need to talk to my teacher. I don't need to make friends here. A lot of our students are looking for friendships and community elsewhere and seeing themselves better in other spaces. And then finally, that comes out, and that comes out not only in their mental health, so higher risks of anxiety, depression, particularly at a very critical time point in adolescent development. We're doing most of our research with high schoolers, but again, behaviorally and not wanting to engage in school. So they feel like the school is not a place where they can be. So yeah, I think that ultimately is what I want to say about the school climate and how faith-based bullying can impact students. And then it just becomes critical for us to understand how we can negate and interrupt that school piece, so that school system piece, so that we can bring our students back into the fold.
Thank you so much, Shireen. Next, this question is for Nadia. There is no way to have this conversation without centering the phenomenon of cyberbullying and its correlates. As your body of scholarship is anchored here, what can you share with us about your research and how cyberbullying exacerbates anti-Muslim bullying? What might we need to know that is specific to anti-Muslim hate, and what are some learnings that inform broader approaches to anti-bullying?
Yeah, thanks, Danielle. It's a really important question. Just to start out, let's just clarify what we mean when we say about cyberbullying. So it's the use of technology to harass, intimidate, or intentionally harm someone. According to the Cyberbullying Research Center, and these are 2019 statistics, so the numbers are likely more nowadays, 31.6% of Muslim youth surveyed reported being cyberbullied in the last 30 days. And regarding Jewish youth, 15% of Jewish youth surveyed had been cyberbullied in the last 30 days. So in terms of the online context, it's very important that we sort of frame the conversation related to how hate speech is allowed to propagate online. It provides an opportunity for people who want to engage in hate speech to find and connect with other like-minded individuals. And so students, parents, and educators have a right to be concerned about online hate speech and the connection to cyberbullying. So there are a few key points that I just want to cover. Some of them have been already addressed by both, actually all the panelists to some degree. But one of the things that I want to highlight is that cyberbullying in general, not just bias-based cyberbullying, cyberbullying is associated with poorer long-term mental health outcomes than face-to-face bullying. So what's the reason for that? The reason is that primarily the online context creates a power imbalance. Because people can assume fake identities, they can manipulate photos, they can reach a wide audience through posting and reposting on social media. So what this does is it creates that power imbalance, that differential that we see that is the hallmark of bullying. So it creates the necessary ingredients for harm, right? And it also leaves the target of the aggression contemplating a variety of questions, such as who has seen the post, how long is it viewable? And so there is this sense of anxiety about the humiliating post, but it may, particularly because it's in the online context, it may be perpetuated for a long period of time. The other thing we want to talk about is bias-based bullying, or someone being targeted because of their identity, or they are perceived to possess that identity. So bias-based bullying is associated with poorer mental health outcomes as well. And this is because, as folks have already mentioned, the attack is perceived to be rooted in a central part of who that individual is, and that identity isn't going to change. So individuals who experience this are also likely to experience anxiety, perhaps to be hypervigilant about when the next attack will occur, because that person's identity isn't going to change. So when we combine the unique characteristics of the cyber context, online hate speech, and opportunities for bullying using technology, these create more harm for Muslim and Jewish youth, as well as other marginalized populations. So although the data on the issue are still emerging, the pieces of the puzzle are starting to come together to highlight that, that risk and potential toll on mental health. So it's important that we call anti-Muslim and anti-Jewish hate what they are. And in the context of cyberbullying and students at schools, parents should expect schools to investigate and act on allegations of cyberbullying, especially in cases where the student's religious identity is under attack. Parents may need to be tenacious and demand action in cases where schools are slow to respond. On a much broader level, social media companies have to do a better job to monitor and promptly remove hateful online content. And one of the issues also relates to legal remedies. So we need more policy and legislation around cyberbullying and cyberbullying with a focus on religious identity. So we all have a role to play in preventing and addressing cyberbullying, but it's very important for us to recognize the high toll that can happen in this sort of way of bias taking form in terms of cyberbullying.
Thank you so much, Nadia. Moving us along, we have about 20 minutes left for panel questions, so just gonna keep going. Dennis, this question is for you. Facing History in Ourselves offers professional development, trainings, many courses that aim to support teachers to feel like they're fostering in dialogue, holding complicated conversations in classrooms, and exploring what it means to be an upstander versus a bystander. Could you share with us more about that and what you and the organization are learning in program evaluation about what moves the needle to foster empathy in school ecosystems?
Sure, thank you for the question. I really want to just connect back to something that both Rania and Saida said about the role of adults. And I think we all agree that the adults really need to get their acts together in order to create the kind of classroom environments and school environments that young people need. I want to step back for a second and really say that fundamentally this panel, I think, raises the question of what is the purpose of education? Why are we having young people come to school? What are we trying to have them learn that will help prepare them? And this is really what Facing History's sort of vision is, to become informed, ethical, and empowered members of society who can contribute to more compassion and justice. And so if that's what we're hoping for, then we need to really give students ample opportunity to practice in the classroom. And this connects back to what Shireen was saying. And we need to counter those kinds of pitfalls of curriculum instruction and teacher practices that I think counter what we're after. We need to, for example, some of the components of the effective classroom approach that I think is embodied within Facing History, but just good education, reflective and respectful classroom environments where students can bring themselves fully into the classroom, where their identities and perspectives are valued. Content, I think, that explores issues of identity, human behavior, in-group and out-group dynamics, the impact of stereotyping and labeling. So really critical to have the content, historical context, that illuminates what the consequences are when we're indifferent to bigotry and hatred. And to see how our fates are really intertwined. That was mentioned earlier, you know. Pedagogy that encourages students to engage fully with their minds, with their emotions, and with thinking through an ethical lens. Because so much of what we're talking about really requires of us to think when we see or are aware of something that's right or wrong, like what is our responsibility? And then opportunities for students to connect the content to their own lives and to interact with peers who may be different from them. And so these components really support students, and I think we have to have a holistic goals for education, that we want to support students in developing understanding and knowledge, right? They need to understand, for example, the misinformation, the myths, the stereotypes, historical and contemporary. We need to help them develop concern for the welfare of others, you know, empathy, people who may be from a different group that you may not have met personally, but deserve the same dignity that you do. A sense of responsibility to do something when they know something is wrong, and a sense of agency that they can actually act. So what's interesting, I think, is to think about adult development and adult learning in the same way, that adults need the same kinds of opportunities to practice. And that in giving them those kinds of opportunities, they should develop knowledge, understanding, compassion, sense of responsibility to teach about these issues, and the sense of efficacy that they can. There's so many reasons that teachers might not feel that they want to touch these issues, right? Politically charged, emotional. What if it spins out of control? What if we get into geopolitics and I don't understand the issues? What do I do? What if my administration doesn't want us doing this? So there are a lot of reasons that teachers don't feel confident. But when they are supported through professional development that gives them these very opportunities and provided with curricular resources that provides those personal narratives that Shireen talked about, that are positive personal narratives from different, that really conveys the complexity of identity, that teachers gain the courage and the confidence to actually start to address these issues. And when they do successfully and their students feel that they're talking about these issues because these issues matter, teachers actually come away feeling like a renewed sense of purpose. I remember why I wanted to be a teacher.
Thank you so much, Dennis. The next question is, to everyone. What do we know about what supports learning and unlearning? What kinds of data interrupts harmful belief systems, misinformation, and tells counter narratives? How do we disrupt the concept that it's Jewish students versus Muslim students, or that anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim hate is binary? And again, open to any of you. Who wants to go first?
I can jump in. It's like, I don't know if we're being polite. And I'll just briefly say it's how tremendously insidious it is for this binary to exist, or to be perceived to exist. And this coming from the space where we have two different minority groups who are the target of so much discrimination, then being pitted against one another. Again, it's like staggering. It can get into conspiratorial places, which is not where I'm going, in terms of what it means to keep this binary in place and how important it is for us to do this unlearning, and to break it down. So some of it being education about not even just each specific other, but about this concept of other. And where does it come from as a social construct? And what does it mean? And what has happened, particularly, I'll say, in our American society, where we have two different groups here, and of course there are many others who this will apply to as well, who for really good reason are feeling very vulnerable. And that vulnerability manifests as deep, sometimes insecurity in a space where for another to be acknowledged or validated, was that an attack on me? Was that about me? Was that making my experience less or different? And how do we raise up all of these different voices? And how do we not, one of my colleagues was mentioning it earlier, make each narrative like its worst or most tragic common denominator, to make every story one of, again, it was saying about oil, like, how do we take away the stereotypes? I just want to give one example that there is a state, which I will not name, that has a bill in its current education committee for the state legislature that's specifically talking, and I was really excited to see it, about adding more minority voices into public school curriculum. Amazing, something that I'm sure like we're all into this. But then I read further, and it has a paragraph where it lays out who are the minority voices, and it names Asian American, Black American, Latinx American, Arab American, Muslim American, and then it says, and the Holocaust. It does not say Jews. It does not say Jewish American. It says, and the Holocaust. And I'm sure, again, there are total examples in terms of anti-Muslim hate that come up in these types of ways. But for me, this was so naming of the unlearning that has to happen, of reducing a minority community, dehumanizing a minority community to its worst or lowest moment, to the thing that is most vulnerable to it, and saying, that's how we see you. We know that that's the thing we have to talk about you, and that's it. And we need to unlearn we need to learn the stereotypes in order to unlearn them, and to be able to approach with confidence that I could talk about you without having it be about me. And how do we get to those places?
I just want to add, thank you, Samantha, for that. But I want to add something different, which is that because I work with immigrant and refugees, as I said, one of the best ways, first of all, hate happens in the gaps in knowledge, not just in knowledge in what we know about others, but also knowledge about each other. And in the absence of connections and interactions and communities. That's where it happens. That's when we go to the stereotype and go to what others have told us about other people. So first of all, for those who are educators on this, after spending over 20 years in schools, I will tell you this, the schools who did right are schools who actually look at their community and have representation of that community. What gives kids belongingness is seeing themselves in the offices, in the classrooms, in that community. It is actually not creating gaps and black holes that others can fill, but actually talking about the topics. You know, how do we connect with each other? How do we create a community, celebrate the diversity rather than make it fearful, right? Food, clothing, celebration, learning each other's languages, all of the learning about each other's faiths. One of the things in my work in Boston was that the Jewish community and actually Muslim community in Boston worked together. We went into each other's places of worship. I'm sure Dennis knows this. We invite the Temple Israel that's next to Beth Israel invited us for iftar. The Muslim community for it. So really connecting with each other, learning from each other, supporting each other, creating spaces in schools where we welcome each other is how the hate is pushed down to where it belongs, which is away from us. But if we're not doing that work, nothing is going to change.
I will just add, I think, just to expand on what the other panelists have mentioned, interfaith work is exceptionally important in helping to break down those silos. If each of these communities are siloed, then they are weaker. And so when communities recognize that any marginalized identity is experiencing the same ostracism and sense of unbelongingness to school settings, work settings, et cetera. It's very important that we recognize that this is a larger issue, as Shireen had mentioned, a larger issue of bias in America. And so the longer I do this work, I am talking less often about Muslims or Jews or one specific group, but making the case that we are all in this together because as marginalized identities, we face the same things, even though it may look slightly different, but it is the same. And so for me, interfaith work has been very influential to not just myself as an individual, but in terms of my scholarship as well.
Thank you. And I think Dr. Awad wanted to say something as well.
Yeah, here to the question of the binary, I think it's really important. One thing I think that people have found very surprising this last year is we've been talking about students, particularly college students on college campuses and all of the activism they've been doing this last year. And it's been incredible actually to see that what's often very surprising to people is in the encampments that the students have been having, most people have been calling, oh, those must be the Muslim students, those must be the Palestinian students. The reality is 80% of those students were actually Jewish with the Muslim students. It was kind of incredible actually to see this very strong interplay together and a united front, honestly. And so I very much did not see a binary on campus with the kind of work that was happening with student advocacy. And I think that's very important to note. And I think it was very surprising to many administrators who were really trying to ping it as this is the Arab or Muslim group, but it really was not, in fact. And I should also say there are many other students of other backgrounds who are not part of any sort of faith group necessarily, and of many different races and ethnicities as well. That's very important to note here.
Thank you all so much. I'm going to move us to our last question for the panel. We have about, just to give you a time check, we have about 6 minutes before we move on to questions from the audience. I just want to make sure we have enough time to get to the audience as well. Not trying to rush you in any way, but just wanted to give you a time check. This next question is for Rania, Dennis, and Shireen. All of your researchers and intersect data, program design, and all of your research is around intersectional data, program design, and implementation. What needs to shift in scholarship, academia, for example, pre-service training programs for school psychologists, counselors, or social workers, or other related fields to better prepare school mental health leadership to prevent, intervene, and repair experiences of anti-Muslim and anti-Jewish bullying in schools? What gaps exist in our current understanding and response to faith-based bullying, and how do we measure safety and constructs of safety? And I'm going to hand the mic off to Rania.
Thanks. Yeah, here I'd really like to speak to a specific gap of the pipeline. As a mental health professional, I'm thinking very much about what does it mean to have, custom tailored the resources that are very specific and also, applicable, congruent both to faith and to aspects of culture, for example, to certain groups. And what does it mean in the research world, if you will, because that then the pipeline kind of one adds to the other. We always say this, the research you read and the literature that's out there, it's about who's paying the money behind those research projects. So when you don't see representation in certain projects, in certain research and literature, a lot of it has to do with funding. And so first and foremost, there needs to be funding that is dedicated to minority groups. Secondly, there needs to be actual members of minority groups who are in places of high up enough to be able to do these research projects and then be able to implement resources and programs. The pipeline becomes really important here. I'll speak of the mental health world, of which I am very much a part of, and it's been amazing this last decade to see how many more people have gone into a field that when I started off, there were very few of us, very, very few of us, and it was very much a stigmatized field to enter. I mean, I was told when I left what I thought I was going to do in medical school to go into psychiatry that I threw away my medical education because nobody in the Muslim community would come to me. Thankfully, that did not prove to be true, but it's just taken a lot of work to kind of destigmatize this entire field. The pipeline here is how do you bring in individuals who others can relate to be able to then offer the services and provide those services. All of these are still gaps that I think are in progress. There's been some, work happening in this, but a lot more work needs to happen as well. So that's the start of this conversation.
Should I jump in? I mean, I think that, I'm bringing a prevention mindset to this. I think it's much harder to deal with issues that arise in schools after the fact, to debunk myths, stereotypes, and to deal with healing after the fact. So I think that professionals who are going to be in schools really need ample opportunity to learn about how to be proactive, how to proactively promote cultural literacy in their schools, so that there's positive information and real information about different cultures. How to be able to include the emotional and the ethical components of education in their teaching, not just the intellectual. How to think about their own biases before entering into schools, and to think about have opportunities to be exposed to some of the ways in which they themselves may traffic in some of the kinds of things that we're hoping students won't. So I think that, kind of building a little bit on what Samantha said about inclusion of different Jews in the sort of anti-bias equity world, I think that's also important, the Jewish experience, because we're stronger as, we have already talked about the interconnectedness and how as a coalition, we're really stronger working together around all of these issues, more than we could be on our own. So those are just a few thoughts about how in-service and pre-service training could be improved.
Thank you so much. And handing the mic off to Shereen.
Thanks. I really, Rania and Dennis added a lot. I do want to expand on a point that Rania made about having more funding and expanding the research for faith-based bullying, because there are a lot of intersecting identities, right? We're not just Muslims or just Jews, right? There are Palestinian Muslims who are queer. There are Jews of color. And not being able to pull those pieces apart and understand these different intersecting identities comes when we have this dearth of research and we're only really focused on like this high level piece. I also think that as we're coming into understanding faith-based bullying, we do have to, and this has been said, I just want to reiterate, we have to understand the role of anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish hate, anti-Muslim hate in this greater context that we're in. Understand that there is a reason why there's a politics that thrive off of these types of biases and the ways that they can come into the school setting, that we have a shared experience of discrimination, and there are solutions in understanding just in general what faith-based bullying is there and what it does to our students. And then thinking about safety and constructs of safety and this idea, again, of intersectionality, We have to learn to let our students tell their stories fully. And I can only speak again from my own research, but one of the things some of my Palestinian Muslim students really experience are things like being told, oh no, your family did not experience a catastrophe, or you're not refugees, that's not a real thing. And that is a form of discrimination that these students experience because they're being silenced in the intersectionality of their identity. So I think, again, having just more resources to study this stuff, to better understand our students, and then to pull back and start connecting it to our shared experiences. And I hope to see that in the future.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. We're going to go ahead and move on to the Q&A portion. We've had lots of wonderful questions come up in the Q&A pod. We're going to ask a few, and I'm going to direct them to speakers directly, but feel free if you would like to respond. We have about 10 minutes for this portion, so I'm going to just move us through. One of the questions that came up during the panel today was, how do we approach this conversation with the developmental lens? For example, issues of identity. And I'm going to hand the mics off to Dennis and Rania first. So Dennis, go ahead.
So I'm really focused in my work on the transition from childhood to adolescence. And I think that with that, you see that young people are developing and maturing in their ability to think reflectively, to think about their own identity in new ways. And in that is an opportunity to be able to think about other people's identities in more complex ways. So I do think that whatever sort of pedagogical strategies teachers are using needs to give students lots of opportunities to reflect individually, but to engage with others who may be different from them. And by encountering those differences, that's really the stimulation of growth, of development, of social awareness, of ethical awareness, and of more mature understanding of the world in which they're living. So I think the issues of identity are a huge preoccupation for teenagers. We need to be able to make that part of the curriculum, right? Put it out there and let's learn about human behavior together. Let's reflect on the dynamics of in-group and out-group issues, and let's use our new capacities for reflection to think about these issues in more complex and deep ways.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Very, very nice. Honestly, this concept of we would call it transitional aged youth, I'll add to what Dennis said here of like add the college age group too, because it goes all the way to 24, and that includes all the college age folks as well. And it's if I can give an example of a course I teach at Stanford to our undergrads, the psychology of xenophobia. And there I center the discussion of Islamophobia specifically as the case study, but then I open up the entire rest of the class. So second half, the whole half of the class, second half of the class is that every student brings a form of a phobia or an ism that they present on. Sometimes it's related to themselves, but sometimes it's also in their backgrounds, and sometimes it's also other backgrounds. And so exactly what you said, Dennis, it's been fascinating actually to hear them literally teach the class, the second half of it that is, and be able to bring, really reflect on their positionality in the midst of all these other folks, like put themselves in the shoes of someone else who's dealing with a certain phobia or ism. And I think that's powerful, and I hope we do see more of that in our classrooms and give the students the chance to really take this on head on for themselves and be able to speak through, not just read what they're reading in the textbooks, and then analyze critically, I should say, what's coming in the news. We do a lot of fake news work as well in that particular class.
Thank you so much, Dennis and Rania. We have time for one more question from the Q&A pod. And I'm going to field this to Shireen and Saida. What are the intersections with this conversation and the experience of immigrant and refugee student mental health? Handing the mic off to Shireen.
I would just right off the bat say that I think our Muslim refugee students in this country, because of those intersecting identities I talked about earlier, are some of the most hard hit by these biases. One, because they're experiencing this anti-Muslim hate already, but then on top of that, experiencing carrying with them a lot of trauma, but also resiliency and all of these biased narratives about refugees. right? Like they don't belong here. They're taking up our resources. It really is just dependent on the politics of the day, whether, what their experiences will be like. So I think often about what it means to create a welcoming school. I think sometimes there are cities that will create just a school for refugees. And I think sometimes that can turn into another type of othering. But what does it truly mean to create a welcoming community from top to bottom? And not only do we have to address faith-based bullying with our immigrant and refugee students, but thinking about their acculturation broadly, allowing them to fully flesh out their identities as they're coming into a new country.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shireen. I agree with everything you said, and I would want to add a discussion, which is who supports children, and its parents. It's actually extended communities. And so with refugee children, often the parents may not actually have the language or the knowledge. They may actually not know what bullying is because they have never had to deal, especially faith-based bullying, if they came from a country where everyone was Muslim. They have never thought about that or dealt with. They may have dealt with other kinds of prejudices, but not specifically due to religion. Actually, to go back to that idea of what children hold and what we ask of children. Children are often, I work with children. I'm both a therapist and a researcher, and I work with children, and they're very protective of their parents because they see their parents are struggling. Their parents don't speak English. Their parents cannot interface with the schools. So what do they do when they get bullied? They can't talk to the teachers because they actually don't know how to talk about this topic. They cannot tell their parents this because they feel like they're going to put an additional, a parent who's already struggling with language, with jobs, with trying to find housing, all of those things. They don't want to put that on them. And so they hold it inside. And what happens is they turn that pain inwards, right? And I think it was Nadia who said before, they actually say, this is the same hate I ran from. It may take another form, but they know what hate looks like because that's what drove them out of their own country. And then they say, okay, I'm out. They may physically be coming to school, but they are psychologically disconnected from the community. To go back to the acculturation from the parents who may not understand what's happening in the schools and from the school community. Those children are, in our research, the most vulnerable children to all kinds of bad outcomes. Again, we are expecting children to figure out things that we are failing as adults to figure out. And I think we need to pay attention and come up with better methods.
Thank you so much, Saida. We have one more question from the Q&A that we would like to get to today. We have a participant that is sharing, in trying to glean the school climate data, there is a hesitancy to ask about faith identity from staff for obvious work discrimination fears, but it leaves the team unable to track students and staff experiences. How can we address, or how do we address getting good data in the context of fear? And I'm going to field this to Shireen.
Could you repeat just the first part of that question again?
Yeah, we have a participant who is working within the school climate, and they're trying to collect climate data around faith identity from their staff, but there's a lot of fear around work discrimination.
Yeah, I think that's really fair. I think there are a lot of ways that we can set up our research. When we think about research, we think about, oh, it's got to be a survey and we got to do it this way. And actually research can be so much more creative than that. And I would encourage schools to think about layers of research. One, in establishing research teams that can help break down some of those barriers of fear, disconnecting those teams from the administration so that there are fewer power dynamics and how that's run, and showing also the school, showing its value in collecting and hearing these voices. And second, not just thinking of research as a survey, but thinking of it too as relationships and being able to do interviews and being able to collect data that way through personal relationships, through focus groups. And finally, making space for people of different faith backgrounds to have affinity groups and feel like they really are valued. for their intersecting identities, and not just because of their teaching certificate, but that their life experiences can also be really important to match with their professional training to bring to the school building. I think with those three things together, we can start to break down some of the barriers that cause fear of people not wanting to share their identities and speak up.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. This session has been so rich. And just, I've just been sitting here in awe of all of you. And, there's been so many moments of, wow, like someone else gets it. And I just really appreciate that from each and every one of you. We are running out of time, so we want to close with a couple questions. Phil, what do you want to share from today's conversation that hasn't been said, or something that you would want to make sure is highlighted and bolded? Feel free to say what you need to say, and then we'll go ahead in the same order as we did our intros. So I'm going to hand the mic off first to Shireen.
So the question is just trying to share what we didn't think was bolded or highlighted today. I think we covered a lot of ground. I'm just really thankful for this conversation. And I hope the audience realizes that this is just a really base level. There's so much more to dig into. I hope people will come to panel 2. I hope folks will do some reading and digging in these resources. And finally, to this question of like, how to create school environments that are able to have these conversations, I hope you create a team of teachers or a team of professionals in your space that can sit down with these resources and further have this conversation. This really can't be it. This is something that has to be ongoing.
Thank you. And then Mike, now to Samantha.
I forgot the order, so that's helpful. Thank you first just to everyone who is listening, who's prioritizing being here, who's taking of your time to be thinking about this. The two things that I want to highlight, these are really vulnerable conversations to have, no matter how confident you are, no matter where you're coming from, no matter how personal it feels. There is a vulnerability to opening these conversations and to acknowledge the importance of acknowledging that. There's probably a better way to have said that, but to not take lightly what it means to enter into these spaces and into these conversations. And the other thing I want to highlight, there was a question that there were so many amazing questions we didn't get to. So I'm excited for everyone who's able to come to part 2. But one question that we didn't get to made me really want to talk about allyship and the importance of allyship. And I mentioned, we know that there's a loneliness epidemic going on, but I really want to raise up the existential loneliness that happens when those who you think are going to be your allies do not show up for you and do not show up for your community. And I can only speak to the Jewish communal experience that has not happened for us over the last several months in many significant ways, in many disappointing ways. And so the question had been, how do you address if a part of the majority stands up and then is bullied for being an ally to the minority? And I want to thank everyone here who has stood up, and to think about, or to introduce the question of how do we think about what it means to cultivate in our learners and in our school communities an allied mindset and mentality that is encompassing, because we know we've fallen short in so many ways. And I'm eager for all of you to be doing that critical work. So thank you for those who are.
Thank you, Samantha. And now the mic is going to Saida.
Thank you. I think something I haven't heard all day is cultural humility in the schools. And I think the ability to sort of really examine our own biases and what we do and how do we do it. And go back to what Dennis said, what is our function? There's a lot of fear in schools. And so doing the same thing over and over again, even if it's not producing what the intent was, which is to really produce kids who are resilient, educated, psychologically sound, able to tackle life. Even if we're not doing that, and especially for children who come from marginalized communities, I think really turning the mirror onto yourselves, examining are we actually doing what we are supposed to do? And then if not, what can we do different? Take this training, take other trainings, but you cannot change unless you have really looked at yourself and the things that are not working. and made some change. So cultural humility, examine yourself before you move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. And Rania?
Yeah, thank you for that concept, Saida. That's really excellent. Something that I haven't heard today that I think is important to remind us all, without getting into a lot of political discussion in any way, but just every time the data shows that whenever there is, actually, interestingly, it is correlates both with anti-Muslim and anti-Jewish hate, our election years, and we are at one this year. And I think it's important to kind of just put that on everyone's radar. The Muslim community in particular tends to really, get very, there's lots of fear and anxiety right around this time of year, what's going to happen in terms of, targeted and pointed discussion specifically about anti-Muslim hate. So just reminding everybody here that if you have students that you're working with, Muslim colleagues, your neighbors, friends, that this is probably on their mind, and very much as it is, I'm sure, as the nation's mind, but nevertheless, certain groups and minority groups are very much feeling it and continue to feel it at this moment. So something to just sort of highlight, and also hope that we can do better in this coming year. That's my hope.
Thank you, Rania. And I second that 100%. Nadia?
All of these points resonate with me, and I would love to, have another session on every one of them. But I think what Saida said about cultural humility resonates the most with me. In any kind of anti-bias work, we want to approach our students or whoever we're working with a growth mindset. And part of accepting a growth mindset is accepting that you're going to make mistakes. And so you may make a mistake or an assumption in working with a Muslim student, but if you approach that with a growth mindset and with cultural humility and with empathy and perspective taking, then the student feels that. And so your willingness to engage honestly and genuinely with Muslim students to learn about their identity and how they bring that to the educational setting is critical. And being willing to make some mistakes sometimes and say, I'm sorry, I made an assumption I shouldn't have. That is very important in terms of accepting that person's identity and conveying to them that their identity is important to you.
Thank you. And Dennis?
Well, I really value what I'm hearing from all the panelists a lot. On the one hand, I think I've heard a lot of stories that are really heartbreaking, about students' experiences and adults' experiences in schools and the larger community. And at the same time, I feel one thing I want to underscore is hopefulness. I feel like just being on this panel and knowing that there are people who have shown up today to learn and be together and to enter into these difficult questions together is for me very hopeful. And I just am grateful for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dennis. And thank you all of you, Dennis, Nadia, Rania, Saida, Samantha, Shireen, and all of you in the audience who joined us today. We're so grateful for this conversation, and we know that 90 minutes is very limited, but it is a start. And to that end, we do encourage you to join us on Thursday for part 2, Where Do We Go?, to invite another round of incredible thought leaders and speakers to share how to bridge what we know into our practice. We know there are so many questions raised today that will be held on Thursday. Leora is moderating Thursday and is here today and has been helping with everything, and it will make sure to get to the questions and make sure that happens. We're going to drop the link in the chat so you can register for session 2 if you haven't done so already. You can find all the information about the speakers and their work on the website, and link will be dropped as well. And we have priming resources as well that houses extended learning learning opportunities, and you can access those resources on the website as well. And all the links are going to be dropped into the chat for you right now. Again, thank you all so much. I hope everyone takes some time to just kind of take a breath. We talked about a lot of things today that are heavy and hard and sometimes uncomfortable, but much needed. And so please take time to take care of yourself, because if we can't take care of ourselves, it's really hard to come together and work together. And that's what we all need to do in order to do this work and continue it. So again, thank you for being here. And please, please, if you have some time, 5 minutes at the most, we'd love it if you could complete our feedback form. That really helps in navigating additional learning opportunities for you as well. And I'm going to move us on to our closing. We have a beautiful poem. And also on the screen right now, you can see the code to scan the QR code for our feedback form, as well as the link will be in the chat. And when you close out, you will also be redirected to it as well. And please stay in touch with us. Sorry. Visit our website, mhtcnetwork.org. Again, you can find all of the information for today's session and session 2 there as well. And just a poem to read for today as we close out and we all go our separate ways. We love what we have by Mosab Abu Toha. We love what we have no matter how little. Because if we don't, everything will be gone. If we don't, we will no longer exist, since there will be nothing here for us. What's here is something that we are still building. It's something we cannot see yet, because we are part of it. Someday soon, this building will stand on its own, while we will be in the trees that protect it from the fierce wind, the trees that will give shade to children sleeping inside or playing on swings. And again, thank you everyone for being here, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.